Hello everyone, I'm Wendell Jones and welcome to this edition of our program, Jones and Company. And on our program, we examine the national issues of the Bahamas, and we trust that you are having a good evening and that your new year began well, and we wish you the best for 2020. Majority Rule Day was celebrated on Friday, and many people understood the real meaning of Majority Rule Day, and it was a public holiday in the Bahamas. And so on our program today, we want to talk about majority rule and some other national issues in our country. And we thought, let's get as our guest on the program today someone who has been involved in the political development of our country over the last 50 years or so. Having served as a cabinet minister for at least 2 decades. We are talking about the former member of parliament for Exuma and Ragged Island, the Honorable George A. Smith. And it's a pleasure to have him as our guest on the program again. Mr. Smith, welcome to the program.
Thank you so very much. I too would like to wish your listening audience a very happy, hopefully prosperous 2020. It's going to be a very challenging year. And Mr. Jones, I enjoy coming on your program because I like this exchange that you and my schoolmate, Dr. Mastinias, always have. I think it's good chemistry when you can exchange wonderful ideas with two very enlightened and very mature and informative individuals in a way that it's entertaining.
Well, thank you so very much. And Godfrey, it's good to see you again.
Yeah.
I know that your new year has been going well.
Yes, Mr. Smith, I want to tell you, the older you get, sir, you look more like your brother David.
Well, I consider that a compliment because the first time, when he was in Jamaica, head of the Jamaican Defense Force, and I turned about 20.
Yeah.
He named me before he went off to war. He had just finished his local training and he was going off to join the West Indian Regiment to fight for the freedom of the British Empire and supposedly the world. And when I started to go to Jamaica while he was still in office as Chief of Staff, Jamaica Defense Forces, and I met a lot of distinguished people, and the one thing they always said was, boy, you know, your brother is quite a man. And I said, well, why? He's a good officer. He said, oh, yeah, he's an exceptional officer, but that's not what we're talking about. He's a fine officer, and he does an excellent job. He says, but I don't think there's one unattached woman in Jamaica who knows anything about dancing that David didn't dance with. And I said, is that all dance? He says, well, I'm sure being a West Indian man, he went a little further. So thank you very much. That's quite a compliment.
George A. Smith, you got involved in the fight for majority rule long before you won the election in 1968. I heard that you were working even as a journalist with the Bahamian Times and did some wonderful things in the March for Majority Rule. Tell us about those early days.
I think that you couldn't have been a student at St. Augustine's in those days, exposed to the Benedictine monks, and not develop a sense of social justice. Because at that time, it was at the peak of the period when the then government, the United Bahamian Party government, influenced by Stafford Sands, had decided that, having obviously made a trip to South Africa and saw the way that the minority dominated South Africa militarily and certainly socially, and had the very repressive government in South Africa. I think Sir Stafford went down there and came back and thought that was a formula he could get the government to implement in the Bahamas. And because they realized that with the number of Bahamians being so close to the United States, being exposed to the United States civil rights movement, the number of Bahamian of color who had gone off to school in many countries, returning back, and the wind of change that was blowing across the British Empire at the time, Stafford obviously decided that if they could pull off 1967, win the election by any means, they would be able to put in motion policies and distribution of seats and selective communities in the islands to shift the growing population emergence of the black people in the Bahamas. It was a very trying time, and I met some of the leaders of the Progressive Liberal Party. I became very close to several of them, and I got involved. I was passing this little place on Wolf Road that the building belonged to Percy Munnins, and other folks, spurred on by men like Lyndon Pindlin, Arthur Hanna, Loftus Roca, Jeffrey Thompson, Warren Lavarity, was commissioned to put out a paper, the Bahamian Times. Folks had been the news editor of the Tribune at the time. And he came over and they started, and by miracle, assisted by people like Dudley Gilbert and George Sands, he kept a machine going against all odds. And Dudley Gilbert was the linotype operator. And I think the existence of the Bahamian Times made a difference. It demonstrated to the Bahamian people the responsible level of the leadership of the Progressive Liberal Party, and other personalities in the Bahamas saw some people, white Bahamians like Alvin Brennan and others, being impressed with some of the personalities in the PLP. And Lyndon Pindlin, I didn't know this then, but while he was a student in the United Kingdom studying law, he used to write letters back home. Some of those I've seen lately as they're being published now by an effort by some Bahamians who live in the United Kingdom. They're accessing these things and sending them, and they're making the round on the social media, but they were formulating ideas about what has to happen in the Bahamas when they come back home. So all of these things were coming together. And I was a little boy on the block, and I was very, very impressed. And then some foolish fellow called Jeffrey Thompson, a wonderful human being, suggested that I could even be a candidate in Exuma. My only involvement at the time, of course, I was a member of the party's National General Council, but I thought of running for Exuma. I thought that was big shot business, because coming from Exuma, I've seen personalities like Donald McKinney, head of the biggest law firm in the country at the time, Robert Simonet, who was Sir Roland's son and first-class businessman, a #1 student at MIT. And I said, tried to ask Jeff if he's crazy, man. I don't have 2 pennies to rub against the other, and then you want me to run for the House? Yeah. But I got talked into it, because we were all motivated by this sense of commitment to see the injustices that were very prevalent in society, that something be done about it. I've seen sufficient to see people of color not being able to go places, to a theater, to watch a movie. When they banned the movies here, they banned the movie No Way Out that Sidney Poitier acted in, and the only place you could go to see people of talent, black people of talent, was Freddie Munnins' Cat and Fiddle, and some big names. So the I Can Do was being manifested in black Bahamians, young Bahamians, middle-aged Bahamians, and parents who knew that they couldn't do too much for themselves, couldn't rise to any level. They saw their hopes and dreams possibly being manifested in their children. It was the most exciting period.
Yes.
And when January 10th, 1967 came along, it awoken in Bahamian people a spirit that they could go and be anything in the world they wanted to be. They just needed to be prepared. And it unleashed the spirit of the Bahamian people, all Bahamians, because things that even privileged Bahamians didn't dream of doing before. They saw that as an entire people, we had arrived at that point where we could start to claim our identity, claim our ancestry, and claim the right to aspire to be anything and everything.
Mr. Smith, expound to some degree on the fact that the leadership of the Progressive Liberal Party at the time were prepared to lead.
You know, this thing about leaders is sometimes very misleading and very confusing, and where real leaders come from sometimes it's not easy to recognize. People have to make you a leader, but you have to demonstrate to people that you share their ambitions,
Yes.
that you share the aspirations.
Yes.
For instance, I come from an island where men who were enslaved were prepared to put their life on the line and attack the British, what was the British regiment, the little force that was stationed in Exuma to suppress Pompey and his crew whenever they got a little gutsy. And then I noticed how some Exumians, like Alpheus Roll, went off to the school in Tuskegee.
Yeah.
And his only dream of coming home was to educate. Yeah. Rodney Bain to educate the next generation. And they were leaders. They were leaders. And even some of the chaps on the islands who never left, they became leaders because of the strength of their
Character.
conviction, their character, and their compassion. And if you wanted to get involved with their efforts, you could emerge as a leader. But it has to be that you have identified with them, their hopes, their dreams, their compassion for their fellow man and all that. And that was reflected in many parts of men from Acklands, for instance. They had it burning in them, whereas it was a little subdued in Crooked Island. You found that the Exumian was fired up. You found that parts of the Eleuthera people were fired up, Andros, of course. And wherever they lived on the other islands, because when we started to win election seats in Grand Bahama, if you go to Grand Bahama, you could tell that Exumians settled here, Androsians settled here. We won in New Providence, places where Acklands Island people settled, where people from the black part of Long Island settled. And so you look at all that, and you realize those are the people who came from people who made great sacrifices because what we won in 1967 wasn't won easily. It was first conceived in the mind of a slave, a man who was enslaved in Abaco, when he told the slave master, "You can't beat my wife anymore," that kind of cruelty. Of course, he died. They killed him the next day, and that kind of thing permeated the leadership of the enslaved community. That was then passed to struggling business people over the hill, people who came from parts of the country where they're prepared to join the police force, join the prison system, put themselves in danger for other people. And you could, if the historians in this country study people well and find out why it is that Exumians and Acklands people and people from Andros and people from other identifiable spots in this country were prepared off to go to war in defense of the British Empire. Well, those were the same kind of spirit that the fellow who stayed behind invoked in the people who he lived among, and it's reflective in the settlements in the islands he came from, which is why when they came down, people settled in parts of New Providence. And it was from those parts of New Providence that those people settled. The support for the labor movement, the support for the women's suffrage movement, the support for the Progressive Liberal Party, the support to recognize that some very special personalities came from them. And that's what really, leaders got to come from among the very people they seek to, but they must lead mindful that they are really the followers, following the ideas and the dreams and the struggle of people, but they're making gains. They're in the front making gains, but they're always mindful where they get their strength from. That's the secret of good leadership.
Mr. Smith, do we in this country really appreciate in 2020 what majority rule in the purest sense was about?
No, I don't think we do. I don't think we do, and it isn't a question of the facts not being there to remind people. It's like, you know, you have to want to know these things. You have to have a good reason to want to know them. And if I don't instill a sense of history, if I don't display that I have an appreciation of our history, I then can't instill it in my offspring. If I don't appreciate the struggles of our ancestors, what they went through. And it is a wonderful story. But it is a story that we didn't tell sufficiently well. And when we were cast in the role of being the ancestors of a newer generation, they're not going to appreciate us because they think that none of that's important. But I think the bright minds at the University of the Bahamas and other young people who are thinking, some of these journalists that you've trained, they will tell this story. And more people will come to appreciate it, because if we don't get people to appreciate how we got to where we are, the challenges we now face, the generation has to face and find solutions to those challenges, will not be able to. I, for instance, was reflecting on some realities of the Bahamas. And the fact is, we have built the Bahamas into the richest country in the West Indies, the third richest in this hemisphere. We built it where we can afford to access loans from all of the international institutions. And yet, in this country today, most of us are not mindful of the fact that there are 60,000 people living at or below the poverty line. That's there, 60,000 people in a country of 400,000. That's 14.8% of our population is living on less than $75 per week. So when you talked today about, in your program earlier, about a woman going and buying $90 worth of food, well, imagine that woman can go and buy $90 worth of food probably several times a week. Many people could. But when there are people who got to live, pay rent, pay for all of everything in their life for $75 a week, and there are some, 60,000 people in a country that the world standard regard as the wealthiest country in the West Indies, the Caribbean.
But from my reading of some literature, in 1967, you had a whole lot of poor people as well in the Bahamas, and it was our country was described as the wealthiest country in the Caribbean. We were far wealthier than all the others down south.
We were.
Are you suggesting that majority rule did not make an appreciable difference in terms of the haves and the have-nots?
It made a difference, and it lifted plenty people out of poverty. The sons and daughters of many of those people, and it was the percentage of the population at the time.
So you have some new impoverished people in the country.
And a larger percentage of the population.
Yeah.
Because just a few years ago it was 12.8%. So in the last several years, it has grown.
Does that have anything to do with our proximity to Haiti and immigration from Haiti?
Well, I think we exaggerate the problem of the immigration from Haiti. The Haitians make up I think the figure is some 7.48% of our population, under 30,000. Now, it is a major problem. But I don't think that the problem, and in many areas, many of those people have helped in farming and in other areas. Abaco, that was very devastated by the hurricane, rely heavily on those Haitians who live in Abaco. They contribute a lot. So I think we've had a serious degree of bad management.
Bad management?
Bad management of the Bahamas.
Over what period of time?
I think initially we started out motivated properly, very cautious, maybe become a little more reckless the nearer we got to this present period we're in. For instance, we laugh about it.
Jeffrey makes the point that the first 25 years was good, the last 25 years was less productive.
That is true. But look at it. I mean, let's face it. We did national insurance, and the rollout of national insurance throughout this country was well executed by Bahamians. The rollout of the Royal Bahamas Defense Force, the central bank, improvement in buildings, high schools across the country was well executed. Today, we jokingly talk about having to take a bag to the food store to get grocery and to roll out there's no ban on plastics, We're just restricting the use of single-use plastic. There's no actual ban.
So the rollout was bad?
The rollout was terrible. And the rollout in terms of we've had hurricanes before. We've had hurricanes equally as devastating as the hurricane that hit Abaco and Grand Bahama. Abaco experienced one. Exuma had Lily. The other islands, New Providence had one in the 60s that did a lot of damage.
Let's see.
We interfere so much now in the recovery effort that the recovery effort is moving at snail's pace. And that's the problem. We are overly interfering in things that politicians should stay out of.
Okay, let's take a break here. And Godfrey Innes has a good question for you, Mr. Smith. Rian Jones and Company, we'll come right back.